Jill Lemke.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, council members. My testimony is going to be a little bit off the cuff because I'm here to oppose amendments to the maps, but also here to oppose Councilman Kraft's text amendment that was introduced this evening, and the table amendment that would allow PUDs in any industrial district, I-1 or I-2. My name is Jill Lemke from the Maryland Port Administration. I'm here representing the port and the 13,000 people who directly work for the Port of Baltimore and my fellow city residents who care about quality jobs. I'm here to talk about what I equate to the definition of insanity. PUDs are why we created the MIZOD in the first place. PUDs are a loophole that allow a developer to build any use in any district as long as they meet certain standards. A PUD is what resulted in the Greektown development of O'Donnell Square, where I mentioned at last week's hearing, brand new townhomes were built within about 50 feet of the rail line. I'd hoped to show a video. I have that video here, and it's a little bit of a sound effect. You won't be able to see the video, but you will be able to
What are we listening to, Jill?
the sound. Oops.
Sound of what?
That's the sound of the train passing by the townhouses that were built because of planned unit development on industrial land. We're here to oppose that. We're here to oppose additional encroachment on the rail lines. This is the main rail line for CSX. This very rail line and the rail line that some of my colleagues will talk about that is going to be impacted further by developments on the west side of the rail line that leads from Seagirt Marine Terminal to the Howard Street Tunnel. As anyone who reads the paper knows, we are expanding the port, and there will be more and more trains using this line to connect the port to the Howard Street Tunnel. As I mentioned in my testimony last week, the port is the economic heart of the regional and state economy. We supply 13,000 direct jobs, but can be linked to 136,000 jobs statewide. And one of the council members asked how that impacts other districts outside of the first district. This issue is not a single council district issue. It's going to affect jobs throughout the city. In 2014, the Baltimore Development Corporation did a study of manufacturing in the city of Baltimore. That study found that there are high concentrations of manufacturing employment in the places you would expect. One of the places you wouldn't expect is Hamden. A lot of those are being converted into residential, so the map might look differently in 10 years. And then there's a map in the study showing the concentration of workers in industrial businesses, and this map shows where those folks live. The darker colors are where the highest concentrations of manufacturing and industrial employees live. That includes the thousands of people who work for the Port of Baltimore, but we're not just talking about port-related industry. So we talked about the insanity of PUDs. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. When people move into neighborhoods where the train blows the whistle outside of their bedroom window 5 times a night, you all are going to get the complaints. The developers are not going to get the complaints. When a business is trying to find property and there is no industrially zoned property left in the city of Baltimore outside of the MIZOD, they're going to move their business elsewhere. The Baltimore Development Corporation study also showed that small-scale manufacturing and non-employer manufacturers, makers, are growing at between 500 and 600%, and they are providing jobs. And who among us has a crystal ball that can tell us who among those maker companies is not going to be the next Under Armour? So we're not just talking about port jobs, we're talking about all industrial jobs, and we would like to preserve those. So we are here to oppose Councilman Kraft's amendments to the text, the table, and to the maps. The port is the economic heart. The rail lines and the truck routes are our arteries, and if you cut off those arteries, the heart will die.
Okay,
Thank you.
Councilman Kraft, you want to respond?
Yes. The 500, 600, 700 block and 800 block of Macon Street, the houses, if you show that photo that you just showed, those houses have been there for between 75 and 100 years, and that train runs behind their house, and the back of their yards and the track there are probably about 25 feet apart because there's a grade there. Now, they've been there 75,
There's no
it's
grade
closer than that. They've been there 75 years, and that has not affected the train's ability to go there. In addition, if you go to the other part of Greektown, from Rapola Street down to Savage, Tona, and Umbra, the 800 block is about 50 feet from the Canton Railroad tracks, and those houses have been there since the 1950s, and continue to be there, and we have continued to build down through that area, and there has been no problem down through there. The other thing is, and I would challenge all of you, is, you know, we've had these buildings in here, and many of these buildings have been vacant 10, 15, 20 years, trying to find industrial tenants. A particular warehouse, and because of privacy reasons, I can't disclose it, had a lease, and that warehouse sat empty for over, I guess, close to 7 years because they had a long-term lease, but the tenant left.
But continued to pay their rent. That's why it wasn't marketed for additional tenants. It was already leased.
But they couldn't, they left because their products they were bringing in, that warehouse could no longer handle those products because the warehouses are too antiquated.
Okay.
Can I address that?
Mark Lauer? Good evening.
Good evening. Mr. Chairman, members, my name is Mark Lauer. I represent the Canton Railroad Company. We've been in Baltimore since 1906. We run over 30 million tons of freight over these rail lines. We urge the council to oppose these amendments. And in fact, we urge the council to oppose all the amendments, any other amendments, including the PUD. One thing that we've not heard here tonight is safety. We are acutely aware of safety issues on our lines. We take that very seriously. And we also know that with increased density, our risk increases. Our risk of accident increases. It's something that bothers us tremendously. the traffic on those rail lines is not going to decrease. It is in fact going to increase. So we urge the council to oppose these amendments.
Okay, thank you. Is this night, what's that, night? Or Carol? Good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the council.
Move the microphone up just a little. Thank you.
My name is Priscilla Carroll. I'm an attorney, and I have worked with SBBA and its members for a number of years, and I'm speaking tonight on their behalf. Along with the Baltimore Industrial Group and the Port of Baltimore, we are opposed to the map changes, which would take property along the Haven Street corridor, which includes 3 railroad lines, CSX, Norfolk Southern, and Canton Railroad, from industrial to the combinations of both commercial and residential, because our mission has been to try to find common ground between industrial and commercial and residential to keep both sides happy with one another in their growth in Baltimore City. Our members at SBBA is called the South Baltimore Business Alliance, is a coalition of businesses that are located in the south part of Baltimore City, and they include everything from heavy industrial to railroads to environmental contractors. Our members are often multi-generational, and they're almost always decades old. We've been working on TransForm Baltimore from the very moment it was introduced, October 12th, 2012, which makes it almost exactly 4 years old, October 22nd, I think. And we wanted to get involved with it, first to preserve our stake in the MISOD, but then secondly, we saw a great opportunity to try to work with the other interests in Baltimore City to have a win-win situation. We saw it as a way to build bridges with our neighborhoods by making sure that buffer zones were added and that their concerns were paid attention to. We've had a history of doing this successfully in the neighborhoods. We helped the City Department of Transportation come up with a citywide heavy truck route that is now in effect since 2012. In 2012 and from 2010 to 2012, we worked on a number of urban renewal plans that affected these areas of industry, and were successful in coming up with solutions that work for everyone. And in fact, in 2012, at the urging of Councilman Kraft himself, we came up with legislation that would require disclosure in all real estate contracts, because he was tired of getting calls in the night about railroad horns from unhappy residents. We've worked specifically with the neighbors in Brooklyn and Curtis Bay on things like neighborhood cleanups. We do that once or twice a year. We have a computer center that we've installed, and a training center and a mentorship that's run out of the community center in Curtis Bay. We have back-to-school backpack programs and gift certificates for kids in Curtis Bay. We are involved, and CSX and SBBA have teamed up to try to put in place an athletic field at the Ben Franklin High School. So starting in 2012 with this legislation, up to the very present, we've been reading every page of the text. We have commented, we have testified, we've gone through each page of the charts. We have gone through each of the maps. So we don't come to this lightly. We come to it stewed in it, and we really want to see it succeed. So the 200 changes that were introduced in just District 1 concerned us, and we're particularly concerned with the 9 changes that were requested to parcels that are clustered around the very center of the industrial transportation route running through Canton, from Seagert and Canton out to the rest of the city of Baltimore. This is not just a District 1 issue. This affects the entire transportation system of Baltimore as far as our freight goes. Similarly, allowing these changes would be detrimental, as well as allowing PUDs in areas that are designated to be industrial. So after working for years on the zoning code, we have great hopes, and we urge your members to follow the requests of SBBA, BIG, and the Port of Baltimore in rejecting the changes of the industrial zoning in those 9 lots to anything other than industrial. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Kraft, Priscilla, Councilman Kraft has a question or a statement.
Yes, sir.
Carol, first I do want to follow up with a statement, and that is the legislation we did a number of years ago.
Yes.
With regard to putting the information in the contract.
Right.
And the information is in the contract, and I actually, this past week, went to review the contracts again, and noticed that the page that it's on with some other things.
Correct.
You know, like forest conservation and, you know, those.
Lots of disclosure.
Lots of disclosures.
Right.
And it's a page that you don't have to sign other than an initial at the bottom of the page.
Correct. That was a compromise.
So I am, actually, I think it may be sitting over here. I'm introducing a bill on the 20th that would require that page to be separated and just be a separate page for industrial and railroad, so that the individuals, when they buy a house, they couldn't come back and say they didn't know, because it wouldn't be buried in the 12 pages of the contract. It would be a separate page that they would actually have to sign. So that makes it even clearer to individuals, because they can't come back then and say, I didn't know. The seller has to disclose it to them specifically. So I think that helps you, and that helps the people in the neighborhood.
Yes, that was discussed back when we did the legislation in 2012, and what we ended up with was a compromise. I don't think, frankly, that any of those disclosures, if they don't have teeth in them, are going to stop the phone calls to you, council people, at night.
Right. Well,
We have to have
let
other
me say
measures.
this, it does make a difference if at least they have to sign it, because we can guarantee that they read it, as we don't, rather than, because we know the experience with the other. So let me ask you one other thing.
Yes, sir.
You said at the beginning about making both sides happy.
Yes,
And creating a buffer zone.
I love doing that, yes.
Okay? All right, so IMU is a buffer zone. That's what it's been created for. That's the purpose, the main purpose
Correct.
of IMU. All right? So below this and on both sides is R8 on one side. South of it is the Canton Crossing PUD.
Right.
Right? And to the west of it is either the Brewers Hill PUD or R8.
Yes.
Okay? So it's pretty clear from the owners, not from the developers or anybody else, that this property is highly unlikely to be used for industrial uses again. But it could be used for mixed use again, or light industrial, which is what IMU is all about. So would you guys be open to IMU as a compromise rather than C2?
That seems on the surface quite logical. However, the mixed-use industrial allows for substantial residential, and that's what we're opposed to, the residential. And you can't have a railroad on each side of you and heavy truck traffic coming through the middle and have residential. And what we're trying to prevent is the problem, not a gotcha on a contract because you knew that there was a railroad there. We really want to get to the root of this, and having mixed-use industrial won't solve that.
So what do Big and SBBA propose that these people do?
Well, I think there are over 24 manufacturers working in these buildings right now. Keep them in their jobs. Encourage that, increase that manufacturing.
What about say that's maybe one particular property, but we have a number of properties there. What about the people who have gotten approvals who have worked for years, couple of years with the community associations, develop plans, purchase property because they've had all the approvals and are ready to go, and where they've invested millions of dollars, what do we say to them?
Well, as a lawyer, I would have advised them not to spend millions before they knew they could build what they intended to build. And we would love to work with them to find something that both profits them and doesn't impinge on industrial transportation arteries, which are the lifeblood of our community.
Finally, if development were prohibited on a setback, and I'm talking about the west side now of Haven Street.
Okay.
I'm not talking about the other, but on the west side of Haven Street, we have residential that is, the backyards are less than 50 feet from Haven Street, and they've been left less than 50 feet for 100 years. So if we prohibited any residential from being constructed, new residential from being constructed within 50 feet of Haven Street, which would put it on a marker with the existing residential along Grundy Street, would there be a problem with that?
Well, I think you raise an interesting point, because I believe a lot of the buildings that you see right next to the railroad tracks and next to Haven Street were the result of a PUD, which is why we urge...
No, I'm talking about the west side, not the east side, the west side.
Priscilla, Councilman, it seems like you two need to have a meeting. We can't sit here and negotiate.
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hold things up.
I was just asking.
I think
Okay,
maybe-
thank you.
Yeah, I think what you need to do is sit down and try to. work
Thank you
this
for
out.
your patience, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Jeff Fraley?
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, Land Use Committee. I'm sure you're sick of seeing my face by now, so I'll be really short. I didn't bring up any notes tonight. Speaking from the idea of common sense, I still haven't figured out how it makes sense to build in that Haven Street corridor and to introduce mixed-use residential in between two rail lines and other properties adjacent to the Haven Street truck route, which is the only truck route eastbound of 95 that connects the southern and northern corridor of southeast Baltimore and the Port of Baltimore. More statistics were brought to my attention today regarding the freight. When Sparrows Point comes online, you're looking at those carriers doubling, both Norfolk Southern, Canton Railroad, and CSX. What happens when they double? The amount of trucks double as well. So if you were to impede on these properties, or if you impede on these freight routes, it's going to result in a negative impact for your community over there. Councilman Kraft, I know you understand how those phone calls go, and so do the folks in the other districts where our industries exist. Most importantly tonight, I paid close attention to Mr. Wilhide's testimony, and he reminded me of a really special thought that I had a few years ago when I was dealing with Mr. McAllister down in our district. He said it best: these jobs belong in Sparrows Point. I don't feel that way. I think our job base belongs right here in Baltimore City, and I think we need to expand on it. That's the mindset of the modern-day developer when it comes to mixed-use residential properties, okay? So if you take that into consideration and you allow them to develop over there, what's next? We're not going anywhere. We've been around for 300 years. We need to continue to expand and provide jobs for the Baltimoreans. Okay, we're not importing folks that can afford $600,000 houses and plopping them down on top of a railroad. We're providing the jobs that matter. I don't know how many of these smaller end jobs that support retail and Starbucks that generate $100,000 a year salaries and family sustaining wages. I'd love to find out, because I'd like to figure out a way to get into those businesses. But tonight you heard it best. Jobs belong in Sparrows Point. And also, a lot of the folks in favor of Councilman Kraft's amendment prefaced their argument tonight, or their testimony tonight, saying, we support the MIZOD. Well, that's great. The MIZOD's awesome. But if we bottleneck the freight corridor, how's that supporting the MIZOD? So maybe my common sense judgment's off, and maybe I'm just getting a little crazy over weeks of this stuff going through my head. But it's an obvious answer here. You guys are policymakers. It's what you do best. I hope you make the right decision and understand that this is bad policy. And with regard to your amendment tonight, Mr. Kraft, or Councilman Kraft, as I understood it, you propose to have PUDs in I-1 and I-2. Well, that'll unfold everything we've worked for citywide. So that, again, is another amendment, if that's true, that's another amendment that is not indigenous to your district, that's citywide, and that's going to have a regional and a state effect. Thank you.
James?
Good evening.
Good evening.
I am James Martin Dwyer. I'm with the Maryland Port Administration. We manage the state-owned cargo and cruise terminals in the Port of Baltimore. And although the port is over 300 years old, I'll keep my comments short. As Jill Lemke mentioned, and Jeff and Priscilla, the port is a hive of activity, and it is a traditional city enterprise. 30% of the direct jobs generated by the port are held by city residents. And it's noteworthy to understand that the average salary of a port direct job is 16% higher than an average Maryland salary. Now, the port needs efficient freight routes for trucks and trains to quickly get in and out of the port. We provided a letter earlier, and tonight I have some maps that I will leave with you that identify our specific recommendations for land use changes around the Haven Street. We oppose most of the proposed changes to those Haven Street land uses. And in particular, I oppose the recently submitted changes by Councilman Kraft to allow PUDs to the city's industrially zoned areas, if I understand it correctly. TransForm Baltimore, as written, captures all the benefits of the MIZOD and makes it permanent. So please do not allow for some of these changes. And lastly, please support freight routes. They are not specific to a single district in the city. Freight is the economy in motion. If freight is not moving, then neither is the economy. However, freight does not vote, and it needs you to support industry here in the city. Thank you.
Thank you.